The first black person to step foot on soil now known as Canada is thought to be Mathieu de Costa, a free man believed to be employed as an interpreter for Samuel de Champlain. King Louis XIV formally authorizes slavery in New France, allowing for the regular practice of forced labor in the colony. Marie-Joseph Angélique, a slave, is accused of setting fire to her owner's Montreal home. Although it's unclear to this day whether Angélique did indeed set the fire, she was tortured and hanged for the crime. The British promised freedom, land, and rights to slaves and free black people in exchange for service during the American Revolution. Black loyalists who migrate established Birchtown, their own community near Shelburne, Nova Scotia. Hundreds of disbanded white soldiers find themselves competing for jobs with their lower-paid black neighbors, sparking Canada's first race riot. The Imperial Statute of 1790 expands slavery to British North America. In the face of widespread discrimination, almost 1,200 black loyalists leave Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone, Africa. John Graves Simcoe, Lieutenant Governor to Upper Canada, introduces a bill to end slavery in the colony. The bill, which receives royal assent on July 9th, does not ban slavery completely, but marks its gradual prohibition. A group of almost 600 exiled Jamaicans, known as Maroons, land in Halifax. Many would go on to help in the refortification of Citadel Hill. After several years of discrimination and poor conditions, several hundred Maroons leave Nova Scotia for Freetown, Sierra Leone. Thousands of black volunteers fight for the British during the War of 1812. Between 1815 and 1860, tens of thousands of African Americans escaping slavery seek refuge in Canada via the Underground Railroad. Slavery is abolished throughout the British colonies by an imperial act. Mary Ann Shadd founds the Provincial Freemen, linking the anti-slavery and women's rights campaigns, and later establishes a school for black refugees in Windsor. More than 800 black Californians moved to British Columbia. Their presence helps defend this British territory, which leads to the formation of Canada's first and only all-black militia unit. After facing rejection in their new home of Montreal, a group of American women formed the Colored Women's Club. The group dedicates itself to supporting the black community in Little Burgundy. By 1909, hundreds of black Oklahomans moved to the Canadian prairies. In 1911, a few newspapers in Winnipeg predict that the Dominion government would move to exclude, quote, Negro immigrants. Military officials authorized the creation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. This group of exclusively black soldiers is not permitted to fight, serving in France instead as loggers with the Canadian Forestry Corps. Hundreds of black Canadians settle in the community of Strathcona on the east side of the city of Vancouver. Barbara Howard leads the Canadian relay team to silver and bronze medals in the 1938 British Empire Games in Australia. The Canadian military initially rejects hundreds of black volunteers. However, as the war rages on, the military eventually accepts many black Canadians into its regular Army Corps. The Saskatchewan Bill of Rights Act passes under Tommy Douglas and marks Canada's first general law prohibiting discrimination. Jackie Robinson breaks the color bar as he plays for the Montreal Royals. Viola Desmond is arrested for sitting on the ground floor of the Roseland Theatre, considered to be for whites only. Desmond's case inspired a wave of anti-segregation activism, culminating in the legal end to segregation in Nova Scotia in 1954. Scouted from the Quebec Aces, Willie O'Ree is the first black player in the NHL, playing his first game as a Boston Bruin against the Montreal Canadiens. Anti-black racism combined with a drive for urban renewal lead the city of Halifax to threaten eviction of the neighborhood's property-owning black residents if they did not voluntarily sell their properties and relocate. The government announces Canada's first multiculturalism policy, intended to develop a more inclusive society, embracing the immigrants shaping its diversity. In the ensuing 4 decades, Canadians bear witness to countless contributions made by black politicians, athletes, artists, and more.
Most people know Viola Desmond as a Canadian civil rights icon who stood up against racism back in 1946. But what you may not know is that she was also a very successful entrepreneur, something that was practically unheard of for a Black woman of her day. But then, Viola Desmond was always ahead of her time. She was born in Halifax on July 6, 1914, and you might say she had business in her blood. Her maternal grandfather ran a successful real estate investment company. Her mother was very well educated and also possessed sharp business skills. All of this had a major impact on Viola's life. In 1932, after graduating high school, Viola started teaching at segregated Black schools in the area. It was around this time that she read an article about Madam C.J. Walker. In the early 1900s, Walker started a successful beauty and cosmetics business for Black women in the US. Viola was determined to do the same for Black women in Canada. So in 1936, she left her teaching job and enrolled in the School of Hairdressing in Montreal. A year later, she was back home where at the age of 23, she opened her first beauty salon in the heart of Halifax's theater district. But this was only the beginning of her entrepreneurial journey. In 1945, she started the Desmond School of Beauty so she could train and empower other Black women to start their own businesses. Viola also launched her own line of beauty products, which she marketed using a picture of her face on the label. And it was this entrepreneurial move that eventually led to her famous stand against racism. In 1946, Desmond was on a business trip promoting her beauty products when her car broke down in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. While waiting for her car to be repaired, she decided to take in a movie at a nearby theater. When Viola Desmond stood up for her rights and refused to move to the Blacks Only section in the movie theater, the police were called and she was arrested and put in jail. Today, Desmond's infamous stand against racism in that theater and in the trials that followed has made her a legend in Canada. But at the time, it had a serious impact on her life. Viola never fully recovered from what happened that night in New Glasgow. She ended up closing her business and moving to Montreal, where she enrolled in business college. She eventually settled in New York, where she died on February 7, 1965, at the age of 50. Viola Desmond was a proud and extremely successful teacher, anti-racist activist, and businesswoman. Fittingly, in 2018, she also became the first Canadian-born woman to appear alone on a Canadian banknote.
Quick! How many people can you think of who battled systemic racism all their lives, yet have more than 50 patents to their name, and helped contribute a new idiom to the English language? Time's up. The answer? Just one. Elijah J. McCoy. McCoy was born on March 2nd, 1844, in what is now Colchester, Ontario. The son of escaped slaves who came to Canada in 1837 via the Underground Railroad. As a child, McCoy was an exceptional student, so his parents saved enough money to send him to an engineering school. But first, they had to find one that would accept a student of African descent. They had to look long and far, but finally, at age 16, McCoy left to study in Edinburgh, Scotland. After some years, he graduated and came home as a certified mechanical engineer. Despite his qualifications, no one at the time would hire a Black engineer. So he was forced to take a more menial job as a fireman and oiler for the Michigan Central Railroad. Part of his job involved walking along the tracks and lubricating the moving parts of the steam train every time it stopped to take on water. This helped prevent overheating and possible fires, but it also made train travel much slower. That gave McCoy an idea. In 1872, Elijah McCoy patented his first invention, an automatic lubricating device for steam locomotives. It revolutionized the train industry. So much so that a lot of people started inventing similar but inferior knockoffs of McCoy's design. But these knockoffs were prone to failure, so to avoid these inferior copies, railroad companies began asking if a locomotive was fitted with, quote, the real McCoy system. It's believed that that's how the term the real McCoy came into usage. Today, people still use this phrase when referring to something that's original and authentic. It's been used as a tagline in advertising, it's been used in product and brand names, and as a title of TV shows, movies, and albums. McCoy went on inventing and registered a total of 57 patents in his lifetime. But for most of his life, McCoy couldn't afford to manufacture his own inventions, so he usually assigned his patent rights to his employers or sold them to investors. But in 1920, at the age of 79, he finally acquired enough capital to found the Elijah McCoy Manufacturing Company. Unfortunately, 9 years later, at the age of 85, he passed away. But his legacy lives on. Elijah McCoy not only helped make train travel faster and safer, he also helped give us a phrase that's become synonymous with authenticity.
Few entrepreneurs have faced the challenges and hardships encountered by Mary Ann Shadd, one of Canada's early businesswomen. Born as a free person in Wilmington, Delaware in 1823, Mary Ann learned about the importance of freedom at an early age. In 1850, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a new law that put her family's freedom and lives in danger. So Mary Ann's family did what so many others did at the time. They pulled up stakes and moved to Canada. She moved to Windsor, across the border from Detroit, where her entrepreneurial spirit flourished. Mary Ann founded an integrated school for the area's growing fugitive slave population, where students of all races could study and learn together. Then, in 1853, Mary Ann started an anti-slavery newspaper called the Provincial Freeman, making her the first Black woman in North America to establish and edit a newspaper. She wrote about the importance of Black self-reliance and integration into Canadian society. She advised on the need for new Black citizens to insist on fair treatment and equal rights, and she encouraged education and hard work as tools for improvement and advancement. The Provincial Freeman also promoted women's rights and often included the lectures of feminists of the day. Ironically, despite her support for women's rights, initially Mary Ann did not place her own name as editor on the masthead of the newspaper she founded. Bowing to the rigid gender codes of the 19th century, she listed Samuel Ringgold Ward, a prominent Black abolitionist at the time, as the publisher and editor of the Provincial Freeman. Mary Ann published her unique and progressive newspaper for 7 years, establishing a circulation not only in Canada, but also in northern cities across the United States. In doing so, she helped change the racist attitudes that prevailed at that time and helped reshape the nation she left and the nation she embraced. That's why, in 1994, the Canadian government designated Mary Ann Shadd a person of national historic significance. By pushing the boundaries and limitations normally associated with her race and gender, Mary Ann blazed a trail not only for Black people, but also for generations of women that would follow.
The road from Texas to Alberta is a long one, but even longer is the road from slave to successful ranch owner. These are the paths that John Ware traveled on his way to becoming one of the most successful and honored ranch owners in the province of Alberta. Ware was born into slavery sometime between 1845 and 1850 in South Carolina. After slavery was abolished in 1865, John Ware traveled west, where he found work as a cowboy in Texas. By the late 1870s, Ware had gained a wealth of experience as a cowboy, driving herds to far-off ranges in the Montana and Wyoming territories. In 1882, he was hired to take 3,000 head of cattle from Texas and Montana to the Canadian prairies. Leaving in the spring, John Ware traveled more than 1,000 miles, herding the cattle to Alberta's Diamond Valley near the Rocky Mountain foothills, arriving in early September. When he got there, he realized that experienced cowboys were much in demand in his northern ranching frontier. So he made the decision to stay in Alberta and make Canada his new home. But it wasn't long before his entrepreneurial drive exceeded his desire to drive cattle. While working for other ranches, he started building up his own herd by choosing to accept some of the wages of cattle. By 1890, he had more than 200 branded cattle and was owner of a ranch on the North Fork of Sheep Creek near Millerville, Alberta. But tragedy struck in 1902. Heavy floods destroyed Ware's home and much of his ranch. Undaunted, he and his wife moved to higher ground and built a new ranch in a place now called Ware Creek. Under his skilled guidance, this new ranch quickly grew to be more than 1,000 head. This would become the final chapter in Ware's remarkable life story. In 1905, Ware was killed in a fall when his horse tripped in a badger hole. But before he died, he achieved great wealth and success. He also changed racial perceptions and played a leading role in the development of Canada's western ranching industry. Today, there are many places in Alberta keeping the memory of John Ware alive, including Ware Creek, Mount Ware, and John Ware Ridge. And in 2012, Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp featuring John Ware. All this is a proud tribute to the dynamic cowboy who, over the course of his lifetime, would triumph over racism, discrimination, and barriers to become a legendary trailblazing entrepreneur in the Alberta cattle industry.
Whenever anyone asks me why I am part of the women's liberation movement, I always reply, because I am a woman. What they've said to me is that since I am a black person, black oppression is the only oppression with which they expect me to concern myself. But for me not to participate in the women's liberation movement would be to deny my womanhood.
Rosemary Brown was born in Jamaica into a family of strong, educated women. She came to Canada in 1951 to attend university. As a student at McGill and later the University of British Columbia, Rosemary faced pervasive discrimination. It was through adversity that she found her purpose as a leader against racism and sexism.
Indeed, I'm twice blessed. I am black and I'm a woman. And to be black and female in a society which is both racist and sexist is to be in the unique position of having nowhere to go but up.
By the mid-1960s, Rosemary was married, had 3 children, and 3 university degrees, including a master's in social work. She was a member of the BC Association for the Advancement of Colored People and appeared regularly as a panelist on the nationally syndicated series People in Conflict.
Unless the women's liberation movement supports the struggles of the poor, of the oppressed races, of the old and other disadvantaged groups in society, it will never achieve its goals. Not to do so would be to isolate itself from the masses of women that make up a large segment of all these groups.
In 1972, she made history by becoming the first black woman elected to a Canadian legislature. She made history again in 1975 when she became the first black woman to run for leadership of a federal political party. Rosemary Brown served as the member of the Legislative Assembly for Vancouver-Burrard until 1986. During her 14-year career in provincial politics, she pushed for legislation to prohibit gender-based discrimination and worked toward improving services for immigrants, people with disabilities, the elderly, and other marginalized groups. Rosemary's years in office showed women from all backgrounds that they could make a difference. In the following years, more women held positions on boards and commissions across British Columbia.
This country, Canada, is beautiful and strong only because of the people of both sexes and of all races. And its strength and its beauty will increase only to the extent that it is able to accept and respect all of its people equally.
It was a beautiful idea, the promise of free, fertile land in Western Canada. At the turn of the century, many Black Oklahomans wanted a part of it. The Canadian government wanted to settle those vast Western provinces, long occupied by Indigenous peoples. They called this dream the Last Best West. With the means and skills to make the move north, many Black Oklahomans were eager for a new life. They wanted to get away from the increasing wave of racial violence and discrimination that hung over their lives. Canada, however, was not so eager to receive them. The Department of the Interior was already working behind the scenes to keep Black Americans out of Canada, including the deliberate spread of disinformation. And while the department answered few inquiries from Black settlers, it made a point of telling them they wouldn't do as well as white settlers in the harsh Canadian climate. The government even hired agents to prevent Black Oklahomans from immigrating. These agents met with influential local Black community leaders, hosted lectures, wrote editorials, and met with interested individuals and families, sharing false information along the way. One agent was a Black American doctor named G.W. Miller. In an editorial, Miller spread horror stories about Canada, calling it a desolate, frigid, unsettled place where 3 fates awaited Black people: poverty, mistreatment, and freezing to death. He also described the abuses that border agents could inflict on Black women and girls. About 1,000 Black Oklahomans settled in the Canadian prairies. But for many others, the promise of the Last Best West soured. The agents wrote to the Department of the Interior that the Canadian boom was dying out. That example of disinformation is more than a century old. These days, we have even more channels through which information and disinformation reach us. Even a simple social media post can have enormous influence. Whether it's the words of an influential expert in 1911 or a story trending on social media today, question what you see, hear, and read. Think critically about the messages fighting for your attention.
Where the pavement ended, Africville began. There have been Black people in Halifax as long as there's been a Halifax. They helped build the city, formerly enslaved people and free Black men and women, Maroons. Together, they dug out its roads and raised its roof beams. Facing racism in town, Black people settled at the city limits. They built homes and started families. They set up their own school and other services the city refused to provide. They built the Seaview United Baptist Church, the beating heart of the community. Despite paying city taxes, Africvillians had no running water, electricity, paved roads, or sewers. Instead, the city built factories, sewage pits, and a prison nearby, then labeled the village a slum. In 1962, Halifax City Council voted to demolish Africville, taking its valuable land for industrial development. The bulldozers arrived as Africville lay sleeping. By 1970, the neighborhood was destroyed, and its residents forcibly relocated to other Halifax neighborhoods. But Africville was home to the people who lived there, and they would not be forgotten. Once a year, we venture out to Africville for a reunion. Set up your tent, set up your camp, or throw a blanket on the grass. The children are playing, people are laughing and hugging, reminiscing about the old days. But for 3 days, you have your community back.